Welcome to today's edition of the IntoTexas AI Podcast. It's your look at AI news and trends impacting Texas. I'm your host, Shannon Belew. Let's get started. Here's a number that should bother you if you run a company. While 88% of organizations now use AI regularly in at least one part of the business, according to McKinsey's latest global AI survey, only 7% of those say that AI has been fully scaled across the organization. And the McKinsey report is not the only one finding this. There was also a 2026 Global Enterprise AI report that was just released from Publicis Sapient, and it surveyed just over 1,500 AI decision makers. 73% of those surveyed said that AI is used regularly or across most business processes, but only 10% said it's core to how the business operates. We've heard similar numbers from surveys specific to Texas companies across sectors, including manufacturing and retail, healthcare, even professional services. Adoption just doesn't seem to be the problem. Most companies are, in fact, now bringing AI into the organizations. However, almost no one is transforming. Ask the people running the companies one question. Does the organization actually feel different? Most of them will pause, and some admit that it doesn't. And this is the focus of today's episode. We know companies are choosing to bring AI into their organization, and most companies certainly don't lack access to AI tools. The real problem is that they're trying to fit AI into yesterday's organization and expecting tomorrow's results. Adoption is not adaptation. I want to draw a hard line between two words that we tend to use almost interchangeably: adoption and adaptation. AI adoption happens when people start using new tools inside the work they already do. We track it through licenses and training, even pilot programs that launch, and certainly productivity gains that we get. Every one of those numbers can definitely tell you whether employees are starting to work with AI. I don't think any of them really tell you whether the organization is adapting to AI. Adaptation comes with time and use, and it means you're tweaking or altering the new tool or the process so it becomes sustainable and practical and valuable within the unique context of your business. Right now, we're seeing strong adoption, as we've heard, particularly at the enterprise level, but we've not yet bridged the gap to significant adaptation of AI across an organization. And why is there even a gap? Most organizations were built around assumptions that made sense before generative AI existed. Information took time to collect, so work moved from person to person, and each one contributed a piece of specialized knowledge. Managers coordinated that movement, and approval chains grew because authority and information lived in different places. Now, none of that was arbitrary. It was a reasonable response to how work actually happened at the time. AI changes the conditions those structures were built for. Information gets gathered and synthesized in minutes, sometimes seconds. First drafts, prototypes, and early analysis no longer require the same chain of specialists. When the underlying conditions change, it's reasonable to expect the design of the organization needs to eventually change with them. Instead, I think most companies are doing something that's a bit more narrow. They're placing AI inside the organization that they already have and asking it to speed up the steps that already exist. An employee finishes a report in 20 minutes instead of 2 hours. That's great, but that report still passes through 4 people who each have to review it, revise it, and then wait on someone else's final approval. The person got faster. The organization did not get more responsive. And that's why productivity at the edge doesn't automatically produce transformation at the center. Individual gains add up, but an organization isn't going to transform because thousands of employees each save a few minutes a day. It transforms when leaders are willing to ask whether the work still needs to move through the company the way it always has. or does it require change? The four things that actually have to shift. So if adoption isn't the final answer, what is? As I've been looking at organizations that seem to be making real progress, I've noticed four patterns that tend to show up over and over again. And I think of them as being the real levers. The first is decision rights. Who is actually allowed to decide something, and how many people a decision has to pass through before someone can act on it? AI can shrink the time it takes to reach a decision. It does nothing for a company that still requires four sign offs to reach one. Now, I want to make the note that four people signing off may be the right answer because of that process, but maybe it's gone from eight to four, right? It's whatever works in the context of your organization, your business. But the point is, you need to reevaluate to see, are you really changing in a way that's going to be sufficient and make true measurable gains for the organization as a whole. So let's talk about then the second lever, which is roles. Not what a job description says, but what a person is actually for. When AI can produce a first draft or a first pass analysis, the human role in that chain has to be redefined, or the person just becomes a slower, more expensive version of the tool. And then we've got the third, which rolls right into manager capability. So a manager whose job has mostly been coordinating tasks and tracking status, now has to help people exercise judgment and interpret AI generated work and make calls in situations where the answer isn't obvious. That's a different skill, and most managers were never trained in it because it wasn't really required of them before, certainly not in this way. All right, and then the fourth lever is process ownership. So, who is accountable for redesigning a workflow, not just for using a tool inside it? Without a name attached to that job, every AI pilot stays dependent on whomever happened to start it, and the value really never spreads past that team, or the risk of that happening is or not happening is much greater. So adoption doesn't really touch any of these by default. Adaptation is what requires all four of those levers to move. All right, let's look at some examples of where I think we can see this working. TxDOT and decision rights and process ownership. So when we think about these four levers, I do believe that we see some local organizations that are making progress towards these. For example, the Texas Department of Transportation, TxDOT, it's treating AI governance as a structural question instead of a tooling question. TxDOT launched its first AI strategic plan in December of 2024. And then January of this year, or February of this year, I believe, it released an update. And just looking at the language that its own leadership used to describe the shift is really, I think, what sums it up nicely. So their executive director of TxDOT, Mark Williams, said, AI is no longer experimental at TxDOT. It is a strategic asset that is now embedded in our workflows and delivering measurable results. Now, that's a big claim. So let's look at some of the ways that it's actually being backed up. TxDOT now has more than, I think, 30 completed or active AI initiatives, including AI-driven incident detection in the Austin area that has measurably sped up how quickly crashes and roadway hazards are getting identified. But maybe a more interesting move from an organizational standpoint is what Williams did next. He actually asked every district and division leader to name an AI lead on their team. This is a specific person responsible for expanding adoption and identifying where the technology can really improve operations. So, getting into that adaptation. That's a roles decision. It puts a name and a job description behind a capability. And then there's the governance piece, which is a decision rights question and probably in its purest form. TxDOT built its update around what it calls a human-led, AI-supported philosophy. AI tools accelerate the analysis and the data processing. Human professionals remain accountable for every final decision and output, and a mandatory human in the loop review applies to all AI assisted work. TxDOT is drawing an explicit line around where authority sits instead of letting it drift toward whichever tool moves fastest. And there's also the process ownership piece. So TxDOT is using what they're calling a readiness scorecard to evaluate and prioritize more than 200 potential AI use cases scored on data availability, technical feasibility, business sponsorship, impact, and ethical risk. And that's a repeatable mechanism for deciding what gets built next and replacing the more common pattern of one enthusiastic team running a pilot that never generalizes to the rest of the organization. And I will have to say that we at IntoTexas are big believers and users of readiness assessments. And so I really appreciate seeing it used in this way for an organization like TxDOT. I think it's really a critical part of the process. Putting it all together, TxDOT didn't just get faster at using AI. It changed who is named as responsible, where final authority sits, and really how the next 100 or so decisions about AI are getting made. And that's adaptation, not adoption. Now, one note that I should add, I come from the infrastructure industry. And so the AI strategic plan that TxDOT implemented is a big deal. This is an industry that's not exactly known for rapid transformation and adoption of new technologies, let alone adaptation. And there are probably, in all honesty, lots of places across the ecosystem that are still moving slowly as AI gets figured out. But this is also an industry that has significant consequences, real human safety issues if not done correctly. So the fact that TxDOT is seen as a leader with this plan is, I think, truly important. In fact, it's been great to see the positive feedback and support from across the industry. Organizations like the American Society of Civil Engineers have even highlighted the plan's focus on unlocking workforce potential and optimizing infrastructure and enhancing data-driven decision making. And then there are national groups like the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, also known as AASHTO, which have heavily featured TxDOT strategy. And I think that's an indication that the broader national infrastructure framework views it as a real benchmark for other state DOTs to follow. So really exciting. And honestly, I could talk about infrastructure at the Department of Transportation for a long time. So I need to stop there and let's move on to another interesting example showing adaptation of AI and specifically what happens when a company designs work around AI from the start instead of retrofitting it in. So this company is called Foxlink Group. It's actually a Taiwan-based manufacturer, but it opened its first U.S. AI factory at Alliance, Texas in Fort Worth earlier this year. The company is putting roughly $9.2 million into renovating about 150,000 square foot facility, and it's even expected to create 900 jobs or so once it's at full capacity. And production is expected to start later this year. Now, this is Foxlink's second plant. The first one makes green energy electronics, and it's based in Phoenix. But this one in Texas is the first one built specifically as an AI factory. And here's what that actually means. So there's one group, an affiliate called UBLink. It runs a large-scale GPU compute cluster in Taiwan, and it's built on NVIDIA infrastructure. Then there's another affiliate, Synchro Robotic, which is building the AI and robotic systems that extend that compute power onto the physical production floor that sits in Fort Worth. The company's CEO said that they are deploying physical AI directly on the production floor, embedding intelligent automation into every workstation and enabling flexible manufacturing that can actually be rapidly replicated and deployed across sites all around the world. But so what's the big deal? Plenty of factories have added AI tools and robotics to an existing line. But I think the significance of this project is that Foxlink designed the workstations, the automation, and by extension, the human roles around them before a single unit, shipped goes out the door, right? Nobody had to go back later or after and ask which approval step could be cut or which inspection role needed to change because the floor was built with those questions already answered. I realize that most companies will never get to build a facility from scratch with AI at the foundation. In this way, it is a bit of a luxury right now. But the Foxlink example still raises a fair question for any existing operation. If we were designing this workflow today with what AI can actually do right now, would we design it the way it currently exists? For most leaders I talk to, I think the honest answer is likely no. Now, that doesn't mean tearing down every process tomorrow. It just means using that question as a filter for where to start. All right, here's another example. This is USAA, which is based in San Antonio. And it's one of the better illustrations I've found of, I think, decision rights operating as a standing structure instead of just like a one time policy or one off. So USAA runs what it calls an AI council, which is chaired by Ramnik Bajaj, the company's chief data analytics and AI officer. And then there are four executives from USAA's executive council that sit on it as well. Every new AI use case goes through the same intake process. Is this feasible given where the technology actually stands today? Does it produce real value for the business or for their members? And are there any red flags? From there, it moves to a dedicated model risk management function that validates the solution is performing as expected. And then it goes into just an ongoing monitoring phase once it's live. So that's three layers of decision rights, and each with a name attached to it. Who decides what gets built, who validates it before it goes out the door, and who watches it afterward. It's the opposite of a company that's letting AI decisions just drift toward whoever happens to be most enthusiastic on a given team. And that may seem harsh or funny, but that really happens a lot. So this is a big deal. Bajaj said that the real challenge is actually, how do you reimagine a business process that is being used to run your entire business while you are still using the whole process? All right, that's a great question. And I think it's one that we often find ourselves asking as leaders and organizations. Now, I will say that one noteworthy item here is that, none of the examples I used today really fully show the manager capability lever in action. And that's not really a surprise, if I'm being honest. Decision rights and process ownership both tend to show up first and often in a more public way. I mean, in press releases and on org charts. But manager capability is usually the lever companies get to last, if at all. And it may be the one that actually determines most whether any of the other three really stick. Now, I will say that we had a podcast about managers in the middle just recently. And so if you'd like to learn a little bit more about how leaders can respond better to this and how we as managers in the middle, if that's your role, some of the things you need to consider. So I invite you to listen to that podcast. All right. Let's close this out. And as we do, let's zoom out because when you do, you can't help but notice how much is being invested in data centers and semiconductor manufacturing and energy infrastructure, advanced manufacturing. Here in Texas and across the US, and all of it being shaped by AI. We are building a tremendous amount of physical and technical capacity, no doubt about it. The takeaway is that the organizational capacity has to keep pace with it. And right now, that's the part getting less attention. A company can put real money into advanced technology and still fail to benefit from it if its decisions move too slowly or teams stay siloed, and if its managers don't have the authority to change how work actually happens. And the technology, it gets a 2026 upgrade, right? We bring in AI and we're all on board, but the organization is still running on 2015 assumptions. So the next phase of AI success inside of businesses won't be defined only by who has access to the best AI models. I think the real difference will be which ones are willing to redesign decision rights, roles, manager capability, and process ownership around what those tools can do now. I don't think this requires a dramatic reorganization every time a new AI capability shows up. I mean, constant restructuring creates more confusion than progress. What it requires is likely smaller and more specific than that. Start by picking one workflow you already know is slow, a customer process, an internal approval process, or a recurring report. Walk it from beginning to end, where it starts, where it stops, who contributes, who waits and approves, where the same information gets recreated more than once along the way, because we know that happens. Then run it against these four levers, right? Who actually has the authority to decide? And could that authority move closer to where the work happens? Are the roles in this workflow still built around tasks that a person used to have to do by hand? Do the managers involved have the skills and the authority to coach judgment instead of just tracking status? And who, by name, owns fixing this process instead of just using a tool inside it? Okay, that single exercise is tedious, yes. And you may already assume you know the answers, but you might be surprised by what the effort actually reveals. And then imagine doing it across an entire team or department or the organization. AI adoption can start with a tool. Organizational adaptation starts when leaders are willing to ask whether the way their company works still makes sense. And I think that's becoming one of the most important leadership questions for the next few years, because you cannot fit AI into yesterday's organization and expect tomorrow's results. All right, that's all for today's episode of IntoTexas AI. As always, I appreciate you tuning in and joining the conversation. If you'd like to, I encourage you to please subscribe and certainly listen and watch again. And until next time, I'm your host, Shannon Belew, and I'll see you soon.